Hello and welcome to Social Housing Know-How podcast series number 3. Today's session is about fraud, focusing on governance, control and financial resilience. We've got some practical insights from our experts, Julie Lennon and Dan McCann. Julie and Dan are accredited counter-fraud specialists. They reside with us here in our team at Menzies LLP. So Julie and Dan, from my perspective, fraud covers a wide range of illegal activities. And the one thing that we realise, and I recognise, is that the social housing sector isn't immune. So I think it's going to be really interesting to hear what we've got to discuss today to help and support the social housing sector and the organisations that work within it. Fraud often starts with something quite small. And my understanding is it starts from a gap in controls, a weakness in oversight, and also from, I guess, the motivation that's created by that, and it creates that incentive. So Julie, we've seen a lot of reports in the press, and also I know you've investigated some cases where senior leaders, interestingly, have abused financial authority. So what's the key thing that you think enables this?
When we talk about senior leadership abusing financial authority, it's a perfect storm really of behavioural and structural risks that come together to enable fraud to happen, and that can be a variety of factors. I've probably got 3 or 4 examples I can give you here. So one is concentration of power. So senior leadership is obviously at that higher level of the organisation. They've probably got less people having oversight of them, and they've got higher oversight of the operational levels that they're working at. Then comes the authority, in that junior members of staff often don't want to question the authority of senior members of staff. So even if things don't look quite right, they must be thinking, oh, they're able to do that. Another risk is trust and familiarity. If somebody has been in an organisation for a long period of time, they're well trusted, they're well respected, and they're often left sometimes to their own devices. And people think, they know what they're doing, and they have, again, less oversight and control over their activities. Another factor is when we look at financial procurement, payments, there's that data separation across systems. I think Dan's got some good examples of that we've seen.
Yeah, certainly. If I take it a little step further, so one thing that we do see more and more common at the moment is data fragmentation, and that is where information could be split across multiple systems. So things like your expense cards, corporate cards, travel and accommodation, and yet we see quite often or not that due to them being on separate systems, it makes the analysis of it quite hard at a cumulative level. Now, just to bring that to life with one case example that we've seen quite recently, a very senior officer at one of our organisations who, let's just say, was ordering things that weren't necessarily for the business, things such as appliances for his house, trips abroad, private tuition for children and things like that. What we did see, because of that fragmentation, is there was no review by any other individuals within the organisation as a whole. And that kind of led to expenses not being actually reviewed under authority for quite a while, 5+ years. So you can imagine by the time we got our hands on it, it was in the 5 figures. But that ties quite nicely into another point that Julie mentioned as well, and it's that junior not being able to challenge or speak up to somebody of a seniority. And it is quite evident across the sector as well. We've got more and more cases like that one I've just mentioned as well, where if it is spotted, juniors don't necessarily have the voice or the confidence to speak up and challenge that person that sits in a senior position.
And so from that perspective, it's important that many of the organisations we work with, they have speak up whistleblowing policies, and that they should be well known and aware at all levels. So what could the board do to identify this?
I think it's really important that the board, the senior management team, set that tone from the top and have that zero tolerance of fraud at very top level. In terms of reporting and monitoring and what goes through to the board to see, again, along with what we discussed earlier about senior management, sometimes there's that ability to override controls. And that can be things like, putting your own reviewers, set them up on the system so you can get things put through the system easily. It can be having influence with finance teams and having those decisions made or fast-tracked without the correct approvals. So in terms of information going through to the board, that can be things like the regular monitoring and reporting reports of a monthly or quarterly basis so that they can actually see the financial figures and the important information and KPIs that enable them to make the right decisions.
And then I think just to add on to that as well for the board and committees is to take real ownership. I think something we're seeing in the sector at the moment is a little bit of audit fatigue, especially in areas where we know that auditors or audit firms have made recommendations. What we're seeing at the moment is that some places they will update the policies, they will update the procedures, but it's just stored on a shelf. It doesn't necessarily embed their day-to-day operations, so it's not effective. So I think, when we do make recommendations, we don't make it for the goodness of our heart, but it's about embedding them and actually protecting the culture of that organisation as well.
Yeah, and I guess from my perspective, very much, a board's duty is to support and challenge, and I guess it's that challenging. It's a trusted environment, but it's challenging that trust, but that should be healthy, and in particular with regards to, I guess, that mitigation of fraud risk as well.
Definitely.
Within both the social housing and education sector, construction contracting is significant. They spend billions of our arguably taxpayers' money each year. And I guess, so from a client perspective, from an organisational perspective, where are the clients vulnerable to contractor and fraud in this area?
Yeah, across housing and education, this is a really big risk across both sectors. And not all vulnerabilities are identified at first glance. So this is where we can give an example that we've looked at procurement and contractor payments, things like schedule of rates. So a schedule of rates is an agreed framework of payment for a particular type of work. And we've seen many examples of when a provider's been asked to give a price for a piece of work under that schedule of rates, and they've actually come in and quoted for a more expensive piece of work, and there's lack of challenge, lack of monitoring of those rates, and that's where education housing providers can be paying double of what they're expected to pay under those schedule of rates. And again, you've got some nice examples
I
there.
certainly do. It's becoming more and more widespread with schedule of rates and frameworks. But I think if what I see in the sector at the moment is you don't really see the cumulative spend of it. So when we actually break it down on a case-by-case basis, the spend doesn't actually look that material. But given 12 to 18 months later, it obviously becomes a lot more significant on an organisation's budget. And I think it's more about having a cumulative monitoring or process that allows you to do that analytics. One thing that we have seen quite recently was a trusted contractor. And the trust or the amount of time that they worked with the organisation, it kind of allowed them to normalise some of the spend that they were pushing through the systems. What we noticed was that they weren't actually undertaking any benchmarking of the prices for contractors. And what we were able to do is actually analyse, using some of the invoices and some of the quotes that we were receiving, is to actually compare them to a relative other supplier and actually work down a breakdown of the actual costs. And they did come significantly over. But I think the main issue that we had here was that they were a trusted supplier. They'd worked with the organisations for years, and it kind of became normalised in, their quote comes in, we'll just accept it through. We know who they are.
Another issue there that we saw was payments being put in just under the authorisation limit. So if an authorisation level was £10,000, we'd see a job come in at £9,995 to enable that automatic sort of escalation and workflow of that invoice and payment. And if you look at them separately, it looks fine on paper. Everything's been authorised and signed. But actually, when you top that up over the year and you've got that cumulative expenditure, it can run into thousands and thousands of pounds where there should have been those set authority levels for sign off. And that's where the information going to the board in terms of financial authority payments and cumulative expenditure as well is really important.
And I guess, is it fair to say, and in particular in this case, that not all roads in terms of your investigation lead to the identification of fraud, and it can be that financial risk exposure more?
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, not all fraud or all the work that comes to is fraud related. I think after obviously undertaking analysis, it's more about us finding them weak controls that are in place at the moment. And obviously some of the issues that we've just gone through, it's led to poor value for money, contractors having to be suspended, and we've also obviously had ill-informed decision making from the boards as a consequence. So I think what it does highlight is that these really small problems at the beginning become very significant over a period of time.
From the sounds of how you're explaining it, quite culturally embedded within an organisation as well. So I guess a reset, and just focus on those policies, procedures, and good practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Once behaviour becomes the norm within an organisation, it's really quite hard to break. So it's really important to go back, refresh policies and procedures, reinforce that communication across the business, and have regular training and refreshers.
So, Julie and Dan, two really good examples, real life ones in both the social housing and education sector. So, I guess just generally, from a board perspective, senior management perspective, what are some of the red flags and how do we spot them? Can we use AI? Can we use data?
Yeah, we certainly can. So in today's day and age, obviously everything is mainly electronic now. You don't have the old paper files and the paper signing off. So the data that goes into the system is really important and it really needs to be clear. So a lot of the red flags we see when we look at transactional data is very generic data being put into systems, other or miscellaneous.
One of our most recent cases, I must say that the use of general text codes is my biggest bugbear when it comes to doing data analytics. And we've recently had one organisation who had a project code set up with very generic subcodes underneath. And I think when we actually analysed the text data that sat behind the descriptions of some of the costings within that code, 30% were actually blank with no description. And then a further 20% that we found that wasn't even in relation to the project as a whole. So I think it comes back to standardising your data and making sure that, if you're going to use free text, that it actually means something in regards to what the transaction is.
Just moving on just from the data to another area, but it's around sort of conflicts of interest or lack of declarations of interests in relation to relationships with suppliers. So it could be awarding work to suppliers who an employee might have a personal or social relationship with, and that leads on to things like gifts and hospitality, not declaring gifts from suppliers, and that can be lavish gifts and hospitalities, and we've seen again recent examples of that in our work.
Mm-hmm. And then I think the final couple of points in this area, one for me would be cluster of amendments. So obviously month end, year end, very high demand for staff, especially in finance, to get things over the line. And more often than not, what we do see around these time periods is that journals will go in, amendments or variations into systems, very rushed. Again, touching on that very lack of detail, which makes analysis very, very difficult. And again, impacts on that decision making. And then I think finally for me has got to be behaviour. More often than not, a reasonable transaction will have a justification. Now, if you provide challenge to somebody and they are very standoffish or don't want to get involved or kind of hide themselves away from it, I think that to me is probably one of the biggest red flags that we possibly pick up on.
Yeah, so that behavioural aspect of, and I guess for me, just sitting back a little bit from, I guess, those red flags, and they're really, really helpful in terms of helping our audience, is I guess, ask for data, don't be shy, management level and board level as well. Continue to challenge, as well as support, and make sure that boards are understanding and getting the answers to the questions that they want to know. And in particular around this area, I often find that, I attend many board meetings, audit committee meetings, and I see the papers, and the papers are well written. But I guess it's the detail behind the papers that you are seeing that one might not be the same as what is being received at board level. So it's that questioning around the papers rather than accepting that that fraud paper doesn't have anything on it because we haven't identified anything yet, but where could it be identified? And actually challenging more and probing more into that. And I think your point, going back to cultural behaviour within an organisation, I guess, yeah, it just puts that red flag up. Definitely does for me as an external auditor. Okay, so moving the conversation now to regulation. And there is now the failure to prevent fraud offence. So what does that mean?
So the Fraud Act has been here for quite a few years now, and that's always been focused on individuals that commit fraud, where they can be criminally liable for a fraud offence. The new offence that's been brought in has extended that to organisational wide, management wide, board level wide. So if a person working for an organisation commits fraud that benefits the organisation, so that could be something like a contract manager colluding with a supplier, which the organisation will then have that contract for work. That's an example. The actual organisation and its managers and its management team can be held criminally liable for that offence, not just the individual, even if they didn't know about it.
Brilliant, and I think that is really the key shift in all honesty. It's gone from what does senior level know and understand to what are then proportionate procedures in place at the organisation, and it's really about testing them design of controls now, not just how did it occur.
And why is that important for the social housing sector?
I think for the social housing sector, it's the amount of public funding that obviously goes into it. It's not just millions, it is billions. And then obviously with that level of funding, it brings in extra scrutiny. Obviously you've got your regulators, you've got your funders, you've even got us as internal auditors as well. So there's a lot of eyes on it at the moment, but I think again, it's just making sure that the designs of the controls that they've got in place are embedded and they reflect day-to-day operations.
It's not now just having appropriate policies and procedures in place, as Dan mentioned before. It's actually embedding that. It's making sure that staff are aware of those policies and procedures, that it's communicated effectively, that they've had the right training, that they know what fraud is, they know what fraud red flags to look out for. It's actually embedded, people know what the risks are, and organisations know how to manage and monitor those risks and report on them adequately as well.
What are your top priorities that you would recommend to the organisations we work with?
Well, I think there's a few. I think we'll go through probably 4 or 5. I think for me, the first one, the top priority, is having a documented fraud risk assessment undertaken. So lots of organisations do risk assessments every day across different operations, but this is a dedicated risk assessment that identifies all the fraud risks. And this can be across operations, procurement, finance. So it's making sure that those risks are identified, there's action owners, and there's clear actions to actually mitigate the risks that have been identified.
Brilliant. And I think naturally the next one on that would be obviously refreshing our fraud prevention procedures and policies. I think over time, obviously policies become very outdated. Obviously there's regulation change, but day-to-day operations change as well. And it's about ensuring that they remain relevant and that they actually embed all operational controls. And again, one thing I would say is it's good to have them, but actually train your staff on them as well. Go a little bit further, test them on it, and make sure that they're aware. That helps with that whole cultural piece at the end as well.
Yeah, trainings there is a big issue as well. It's people being aware of what fraud is, how it occurs, how it manifests, what it looks like, goods and bads, what you can do, what you can't do. So it's actually training your staff to have that understanding, communicate it across the business, and making sure that it's regular training, it's refreshed. It's not just one set of training that's done and never looked at again.
And then I think the last point from me is obviously monitoring. It's ensuring that obviously we're using our data appropriately. We have a lot of it in the housing and education sectors, but I think it's targeting them anomalies that we're finding, actually diving into the data a little bit deeper and understanding what it actually means. And then that obviously drives through to the decision making from our board and committees and senior leadership teams as well. So it's ensuring that they've effectively got the right information to do their role.
And I guess what I'm taking overall is that from board through to senior leadership team and management, then then we can help. I guess it's get in touch, the audience that's listening, we can definitely help and support, and you can carry out that good work. So I think what we've heard today is that within the social housing and education sector, fraud rarely starts in a dramatic way. It's often incremental by gaps in systems, controls, processes, and that includes governance and oversight as well. Thank you to Julie and Dan, who have helped us today with some insights and some practical ideas. Thank you for joining us for more Brighter Thinking from Menzies LLP. You can catch up on our Social Housing Know-How podcast series and sign up for future episodes via our website. And we look forward to next time.